So thank you again. So in the interest of trying to make sure everybody gets time to talk, let's move straight along for James Hamlin from the University of Florida. James, if you can share your screen. And meanwhile, I'll just, okay. Yeah, go ahead. James Hamlin from University of Florida. Why don't you just take it away?
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep, we hear you fine.
Okay, great. I'm recovering from cold, so if I stop to cough, please forgive me. So this title of the talk, Extracting Data from Scientific Publications, is kind of a story of a personal journey of dealing with some issues with publications and trying to figure out how to really get at the data that's inside them. So I'm going to review a few different topics here, kind of beginning with an old europium paper that I was a part of, onto this carbonaceous sulfur hydride room temperature superconductor, some recent findings about manganese disulfide, and then just some sort of personal thoughts that have come to me after being involved with this for a couple of years now. So let's begin with europium and kind of going back in time. One of the last things I worked on during my PhD was this PRL paper. Debesai was the first author. And I had been involved in some early measurements that kind of weren't ready to publish. And after I went on to be a postdoc in San Diego, Matthew Debesai finished up the measurements and found this very nice susceptibility data plotted here on the right. So these are voltages from AC magnetic susceptibility coil, where when you cool below the superconducting transition, there's a sudden drop in the resistance as the flux is expelled from the sample. And so we found the paper reports both anomalies in the resistance, although not complete drops in the resistance, and then these nice susceptibility transitions. And so now I'm going to jump forward in time over a decade to another paper. So this was a very low temperature superconductor. In 2020, this paper, Room Temperature Superconductivity in a Carbonaceous Sulfur Hydride, came out. And this paper reported results using the same susceptibility technique. Again, these are nanovolt measurements. So you see a drop in the voltage as you cool below the superconducting transition temperature claimed. So here the temperatures are much higher. So these are up close to 200 Kelvin, very, very high temperature superconductivity. I was quite excited to see this. My former colleague, Matthew, was a co-author, and it was beautiful results. I looked at this data and it looked like just about the size I would expect the transition to be from the information given in the paper. The noise levels were sort of what I expected. Everything looked exactly as I thought it should, according to what I knew about this AC magnetic susceptibility technique. Okay, so why have I mentioned this 2009 paper and then this 2020 paper? Well, soon after this room temperature superconductivity paper came out, Jorge Hirsch began asking questions about it, and he spoke to me about the magnetic susceptibility because he knew I had done these kind of measurements. And in those conversations, he eventually began to question the superconductivity in europium. And he published this archive article that pointed out what he called remarkably similar curves in europium and the europium and CSH papers. I've taken the two curves that are under question here and tried to make them look as similar as possible by scaling the X and Y axes. And I did not find this very convincing that this was the same data. Of course, there was some question about the upturn here. In europium, you might expect that from polyparamagnetism or from paramagnetic susceptibility tail at the low temperatures, but in CSH at much higher temperatures, you wouldn't expect that. But I didn't find this particularly compelling, but nonetheless, in this article, he pointed out a possible reason for this similarity being a common author. And I thought this was premature to highlight that, but nonetheless, it turned out that he was right. And so I'm going to explain the issues that were found in both of these papers. So after we were pressed for the raw data, eventually that data was discovered on an old computer, and I obtained that data. There were 65 raw data files, an origin lab file that was used to produce the plots in the PRL paper, and I also got scans of a laboratory notebook. And when I began looking at this, problems became apparent very quickly. If I looked just at the origin lab file, there was really nothing there that pointed to problems. But when I began looking at the, beginning from the raw data files, things became clear. So this plot here shows the coil voltage versus temperature, and it basically shows the series of steps that's necessary to transform sort of what was measured into what was published. So here, the blue data is what was published in the PRL article, and the orange data is what should have been there, or what was actually there in the data. So the first step is you scale the transition to 49% of its initial amplitude. You then subtract a line from that data. Now we can see that this portion of the data, so I'm sort of modifying the orange data step by step to get to the blue data. So we line up down here, but there's still this area of disagreement. So next you have to delete that data, that little blip there. And then you have to take this portion of the data, just this higher temperature portion of the data, shift it down by 60 millikelvin, and then you have to subtract a constant from that to get to this data. Now you get perfect agreement. And because I had all of the data files in question, I was really able to, through performing this series of steps, get perfect agreement between the data published and the data that I was able to obtain through this series of steps. So that was one example for the 111 GPa data. Here's another example for the 142 GPa data. So blue is what was published in the PRL, and orange is what was actually in the data files. So here you can see essentially what's been done is this whole thing at low temperature has been sort of gotten rid of here. So the first thing is it's scaled to 52% of its original amplitude. Then we add a line. So now you can see this high temperature portion of the data lines up. And then some of this low temperature portion of the data was shifted up. So now we get agreement here. But there was still this puzzling region in the middle here where I couldn't figure out where that data had come from. So right here, I had no explanation for this. What I did was I took all 65 of those raw data files, and I took a set of data points, and I compared some segment of data points against every other segment of data points in every other one of the 65 data files. So this script took about 15 minutes to run. I then took the difference between the shifted data and the original data, calculated the residual, and then sorted kind of the files and the line number offsets by residual. And very quickly it popped up a certain portion of data where this data clearly came from. And so it came from a different data file and a different temperature range. So data from down around 2 Kelvin, irrelevant to this data up around 2.5, was simply copied and pasted up into this region. And you can see that very clearly by comparing the data up here with the data down here from this other file. Okay, so what was the reason for these anomalies? So there's clearly something happening in the data. Where was it coming from? Well, it just so happened that a postdoc working in my group had spotted some similar anomalies just a few months earlier and figured out what they were. So at the time, we were using a gas-loaded diamond anvil cell. So essentially, there's a helium-filled membrane, and by applying a small amount of gas pressure to this membrane here, you can push the diamonds together and obtain a much higher pressure inside the diamond anvil cell. Well, at high enough pressure of the gas, the helium in here at low enough temperatures can freeze. And what my postdoc Isaiah Lim recognized was that some anomalies he saw in beryllium gold matched very well the melting curve of helium. So when the helium solidifies, there's a small change in the force, creates a small change in the pressure in the cell, and that can then create an anomaly in whatever you're measuring. And so if you plot the anomalies in europium, both the susceptibility and resistivity anomalies agree quite well with the melting curve of helium. Okay. So there were two things going on in this problem with this paper. There was an artifact due to this feature, which the interpretation was then obscured by altering the data to make it appear to be very consistent with superconductivity. So the outcome here was that the paper was retracted. So not only did we find that the data had been altered, but one of our co-authors also repeated the measurements using a cell without a membrane and didn't find that the superconductivity was there, confirming that these features were likely due to superconductivity, were likely due to this artifact from the pressure in the membrane. And you'll notice this sentence that the data presented in figure 2 were not accurately reported. So this is a statement that we could get everyone to agree on. And when trying to get a retraction published as quickly as possible, getting everyone to agree on it is a necessary step. So this experience was obviously very stressful. Retractions, it's hard to not feel anxiety that the retraction is going to affect your reputation. But I think being open and honest about what actually happened in this case is the best that I can do. So let me now move on to carbonaceous sulfur hydride. So with this europium paper now retracted, there was additional pressure to obtain the susceptibility raw data for this room temperature superconductivity paper. And that data was eventually published in the form of over 100 pages of sort of low resolution images of tables. So this was not a particularly easy way to get at the data, although initially thinking it might be a lot of work, I found that in about a half a day, I was able to get the data out. You know, you have a one-liner on the Unix command, on the Linux command line will dump all of the images out of a PDF paper, and then another one-liner will do OCR on all those pages and dump it into a series of files. And then you can simply plot the data, and occasionally there'll be errors in the optical character recognition, but they immediately become very clear when you plot the data, and then you can go back and look and correct the data. So, okay, so even if it's not the most convenient form of presenting the data or making the data available, really any way of making the data available is helpful for assessing the reliability of it. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about the problems with the susceptibility data because Dirk van der Marel has another talk associated with this workshop that goes into greater detail about what was found. But on the left here, we have the susceptibility data. And this 160 GPa data, when you look in the paper, you don't really notice any particular issues here. However, with access to the data files and the numbers, these sort of strange artifacts became clear. So if you look at this plot here, panel C, that comes from this region sort of down here somewhere. And then this plot up here comes from a region up here. All right. And so you see what looks like kind of a smooth curve connected by these jumps. These jumps turn out to be all the same size. And you can then think of just lining these all up. It's rather straightforward to write an algorithm that does that automatically. And what you find then is that there is a smooth curve here. And so when I saw this, I was able to reproduce this quite quickly, and I found that this smooth curve was a cubic spline. Van der Marel and Hirsch also independently came to the same conclusion that this was a cubic spline. Now, initially, people who saw this had a sort of a charitable explanation of it, which was a reasonable one, that perhaps what had happened was that the authors, when they did a background subtraction, so let me explain the background subtraction briefly. At high pressure, this is a very, very tiny sample. And so this transition, particularly in low temperature measurements, could be riding on a large background. And so typically what you do is you measure at a nearby pressure where the TC is at a different temperature, and then you subtract the two measurements from each other, and you get rid of most of the background. So I think what some people interpreted this as is perhaps the authors had used a cubic spline or some kind of smooth curve as the background. Perhaps they fit their data with the spline and then simply subtracted that spline from the data being digitized as any data from a digital instrument is, would then take on this kind of shape. And that's a fairly reasonable thing to think. So I don't think this by itself is really a clear indication of a definite problem. But the problem comes when you look more closely at the data published in that archive article I showed you, where optical character recognition was used to extract the data. So in that paper, they published both the published data and the raw data. And so if you have the published data and the raw data, it's quite easy to obtain the background that must have been used, because the published data should be the raw data minus the background. Okay, and then this is where things become hard to understand as just a simple background subtraction of a spline. And again, Dirk van der Marel has given a very nice presentation on all the reasons why that explanation doesn't make sense. I will give you my kind of short version of that. So the authors state that the published data is the raw data minus the background. So what we see here in this plot is temperature. And now instead of just the voltage, we have the difference in voltages. So this is the difference between the voltage of two adjacent data points. And the published data here is in blue. And what you see is that it sort of goes up here. So this is plotted in the vicinity of the superconducting transition. So this peak here is where the susceptibility is rapidly increasing. Okay. And then the raw data is also what was put in that archive article. The background is what you find by using this equation. Okay. So now what you find is that the published data has these very discrete increments indicated by the gray lines here. So it changes by mostly these increments of, I think, around 0.16, 0.17 nanovolts, all right? Now, to suppose that the published data is the raw data minus the background, we have to somehow assume that you take this sort of random raw data and you subtract this random background data, and somehow you now get this perfectly digitized data. And I simply can't understand how that could happen. And the authors have offered no explanation of how that could happen, although they've repeatedly said that they have offered an explanation. It's not there in anything that's been published in an understandable way. So the straightforward explanation here is that instead, the raw data is actually the published data plus some kind of background measurement, which is some kind of noisy measurement. So obviously, if the raw data cannot be raw data, it sort of calls into question this whole result. Okay, so these kinds of concerns and others, I think, eventually led to the retraction. So the paper was retracted. They say here that the details of the background subtraction were not specified in the paper. The authors maintain the raw data provide strong support of the main claims of the original paper. So sometime later, or during this whole process, in February of 2022, I had raised concerns also about the electrical resistance data. And I requested the raw resistance data via the Nature editor and didn't receive it. So having gone through that process in February, I was somewhat surprised to see in September the following quote in this article that appeared in Science. Another senior member of the collaboration points out the retraction does not question the drop in electrical resistance, the most important part of any superconductivity claim. Well, at that point, I had questioned the electrical resistance data in the paper. Here is the electrical resistance data in the paper. And so the question is, how could I get at this data if the authors did not share it? Well, it turns out that both of these plots are plotted in a vector graphics format in the paper. So what that means is that if you zoom way in on the plot, it sort of remains sharp. So here you can see a contrast between a raster or bitmap plot and a vector graphics plot. They've both been zoomed way in. And so here, as you zoom way in on the raster plot, it gets kind of blurry, right? And this plot is just using kind of a grid of pixels to define the data. So there's no information about this blue curve that goes underneath this black data. There's no way that you can get at that blue data underneath this black curve. As I was sort of looking at these plots and zooming in to very high magnification to try to see what was going on, I noticed that my PDF program sort of rendered the data very slowly. And you could actually see these data points kind of gradually appearing, particularly at high zoom. And so that gave me the idea that, really all the data, even the data, say, behind these yellow points, is somewhere in the file. It should be accessible, right? So somehow this type of plot is generated by a set of instructions that tell the computer where to draw the lines on the page. And so somehow you ought to be able to get at those instructions. Okay, so can we extract the data using vector graphics instructions? So the answer is yes. You can read about that in this archive post, which also has a link to a GitHub repository that contains all the methods used to do this, all the methods used to generate the plots in this paper. There's also a Zenodo repository that has all the data that I extracted using this method. So what are the steps? Sort of briefly, you can take the entire page of a PDF and you can convert it into what's called the SVG format using a utility called PDF to SVG. So this stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. It's basically a XML file. Then you can look at the plot, and you can use a color picker, or another program that's quite useful is Inkscape. You can figure out what the color is of the particular kind of data point that you're interested in. And then there's a Python library called SVG Path Tools, which has some useful features that allows you to pull out various paths from the SVG, and you can then filter them by color, or if you could, for example, filter them by the number of edges. So if you wanted to distinguish rectangles from hexagons, that would be fairly straightforward. So you then compute the centroid of all those vertices of the path to find where the data point actually is. Or in some plots, you've simply got line segments, which are sort of rendered as a single path with many different sets of coordinates in it. So here's an example of a red data point. Once you've got the file in SVG format, you can simply open it with a text editor, and you can look at all the instructions. You can search for values with particular colors, and it becomes a puzzle. It's not straightforward, but you can do this. I'm working with a student now to try to make this into a more sort of general use tool, like the old data thief, where you could open a plot and then there'd be a set of options to allow you to extract different types of data. So at the moment, it's fairly labor intensive to pull this out, but you can even do things like find the coordinates of the tick marks and use that to get a very accurate calibration of the data points, of the plots, of the scale. So I wanted to confirm that this method works. And so the way that I did that was using some data where I had access to the raw data. So I picked something recent, a 2021 PRB article by Lim et al., where we measured pressure-dependent superconductivity in beryllium-22 rhenium. And if you look at this 15 GPa data curve, that's the one I elected to extract. And the reason for that is that a lot of the data is hidden by other data, both in the high and low temperature regime. So using something like Data Thief or this web plot digitizer, which is a common tool people use, you'd never be able to get at those data points. However, using these methods that I just discussed, you can in fact get at these data points. So here you can see some data points here that are obscured in this region that are extracted with very, very high fidelity. And then again, down here at low temperature, that 15 GPa curve is completely obscured, but you can still extract the data quite accurately. So here the blue are the raw data points, the ones that I had access to because this data was collected in my group. And then the orange is the data that was extracted. And you can see that it's not perfect, right? So here the raw data shows a bit of a difference, but the extracted data does not. That's because even in the SVG file, the coordinates are not stored with infinite precision. In order to keep the file size small enough, there's some truncation of the digits. Okay, so here again are the data from the CSH paper. It just so happens that both plots show the same data set from 267 GPa. So here we can extract from both plots and see how they compare to see, to assess the fidelity of the extraction. So here's the original plot from the paper. Here's one generated after I extracted all the data, and you can see that you can zoom in on this region here, and you get all the data out, even though the points are overlapping in that region. So here's a small, zoom in of a small segment where both data sets are, both the data from two different figures are both available, and you can see it agrees very well. And we see this very unusual digitization artifacts, very similar to those in the susceptibility data. There's sort of smooth data, and then these discrete jumps that all happen to be the same size. So you can disentangle these jumps from this smooth part, just like was done for the susceptibility data. So here's the susceptibility version. So the green is the published data. You can disentangle it into these discrete jumps and this smooth cubic spline. And something similar can be done here for the resistivity data. So again, it looks like essentially there has been some background subtraction. So Diaz and Salamat explain these susceptibility artifacts in this archive article as being due to, they say this effect is a consequence of the user-defined background. Of course, in resistivity data, there should be no background, and certainly none is stated in the paper. Okay, so I'm going to jump very briefly to something more recent. I will say that after I expressed these concerns, future resistivity plots from this group in later papers were all in raster format so that I could not use this method. So I started looking at some older data. And I found this manganese sulfur 2 paper, and I was comparing it to the dissertation of one of the co-authors. And I found what looked like very similar data sets. So we have here 13.5, 16, and 24 GPa data on germanium, selenium 4. And here we have 13, 16, and 26 GPa data on manganese sulfur 2. And these look really remarkably similar, considering these are completely different compounds. So I extracted the data here. I'll say that if you cite along the curve of this green curve in the paper, you can see this little blip here, even without digitizing it. But I used my digitization methods. And so what you see here on the left is sort of the full temperature range of data, where manganese sulfur 2 and germanium selenium 4 have been plotted on left and right y-axes with different extents, right? And so I think immediately it's pretty clear that they're very similar in a number of ways, although there's more curvature at high temperature for germanium selenium 4. However, if you zoom in just below 120 Kelvin, you find that the data agree almost perfectly. And so we can look at that in a little more detail here for one of the low pressure measurements. So again, even these little kind of double wiggles here are present in both data sets. The blip, which when you look just at low temperature, very clearly resembles this. So I should be clear that in this paper, the only issue I found was with the resistance data. So let me make some concluding remarks here, which are sort of thoughts after having gone through this experience of dealing with all these issues for some time. So concerning the CSH data, in the absence of better explanations, the most straightforward conclusions are that the raw data is derived from the published data for the susceptibility, that the electrical resistance data has been subject to some kind of unstated background subtraction, and that the electrical resistance data for manganese sulfur 2 is derived from data on germanium selenium 4 earlier published in the PhD dissertation of Diaz. So, okay, so the CSH paper has been retracted. So why is this relevant? Well, there are a number of very remarkable claims coming from this group about near ambient conditions superconductivity. And so these authors should address these 3 items above and approach their future claims with full openness about their methods and what's been done with the data. So some last kind of conclusions about reproducibility. So I think we certainly need a culture change about publishing raw data. I'm not sure how to bring that about. The steps to produce the plots should be fully documented, ideally in some kind of script, Python or MATLAB script that takes you exactly from the raw data to whatever published data or graphs you have. And then, one idea, excuse me, would be to have a reviewer whose sole charge is just to confirm that the data and analysis are properly archived and documented without really assessing their validity. So those items are rather difficult to implement. One that's very easy to implement is that journals should require graphics to be submitted in vector format whenever possible. This is a very simple step that requires little additional effort. Most journals have a statement that this is true, but if you actually look through those journals, you find that relatively few plots are actually presented in vector format. And then finally, maybe perhaps a silly idea, we need a journal of negative, incomplete, and boring results, which would help reduce pressure to alter or over-interpret data. So I think in economics, there's a journal called a series of uninteresting results in unsurprising results in economics. And so we need to find a way of rewarding people for getting their data out there, even if they haven't come up with a brilliant and exciting interpretation of it. That will also prevent wasted and replicated effort. So, okay, I will stop there. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, James, thank you for this pretty heroic story. I think we all appreciated it. Okay, we have a couple questions. We have about 4 minutes before we have to move on. One came early from Babak Saraja is, how did the preprints repository like archive, what's the role that it played here? And for example, a lot of us remember that Jorge Hirsch was banned from the archive for engaging in this business. Any comments you want to make about how the role the archive played in all of this?
I mean, that's a fairly broad question. I think the archive is obviously very, very useful. I think there's a problem where the discussion becomes contentious. I think there needs to be some kind of method to comment on papers in a more, perhaps if papers had a commenting feature on there. I mean, there is PubPeer, but I think PubPeer has a stigma. It would be nice if there were a way of discussing and commenting on papers that didn't have quite the same stigma.
Okay, here's a question from Peter Armitage. He says, James, I was unclear on the timeline. He may have missed it. The comment from Salamat was after you brought your analysis to the attention of the Nature editors or before?
The comment where they published the raw data was before I was in contact with Nature editors.
Okay, I have a sort of personal question for you. Like this stuff that you're doing took a lot of time and effort. Was it like stressful to feel, or did you feel like you had to put your other research on hold to do this, or were you staying up late at night doing this? Like, what was the cost of doing all this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it was extremely stressful, of course, at the point that it was tied up with, the retraction of a paper on which I was co-author. It was extremely stressful, and that was a driving force behind, trying to figure things out. I think I can take away from it that I learned a lot about data analysis. So I learned Python while, coming to all these conclusions. So I can take that away from the process.
Okay, sorry, one more question from Peter Armitage. Can you give any thoughts on how the Europium data was falsified, or how has your co-author explained himself?
I think there's a combination here of, an artifact that caused misleading data. And then there was, in my opinion, an effort to make that data look 100% convincing. I think that, I guess the thought that keeps coming to mind is you can't outsmart nature. And it's okay to be wrong as long as you present the data accurately. But as soon as you stop presenting the data accurately, you're asking to be fooled. I can't speculate on the psychology behind what happened.
Okay, Peter points out that you can in fact outsmart nature if by nature you mean the journal. Okay. Okay, I think that's pretty much all we have time for. James, thank you.